Have you ever noticed how small things can completely destabilize your day? A message, a criticism, an unexpected piece of news, and suddenly your peace is gone. Maybe you pray, try to calm yourself down, but inside you're still reacting. What if the problem isn't a lack of faith, but a lack of strategy? What if there's a spiritual weapon capable of strengthening your mind and stabilizing your emotions, and you're simply not using it yet? In this video, you'll understand why the Bible says in 1 Thessalonians 5:18 to give thanks in everything, and how that goes far beyond a nice or religious attitude. We're going to uncover why gratitude is not a passive feeling, but an active tool of inner governance, capable of interrupting cycles of anxiety, insecurity, and emotional reactivity. You'll discover how to turn gratitude into practical mental strength for everyday life. If you've been feeling emotionally unstable, easily irritated, discouraged, or drained by circumstances, this video can change the way you respond to life. Stay until the end, because you won't just hear about gratitude. You'll learn how to use it to regain control, clarity, and stability, even when everything around you is trying to take that from you. You don't lose your peace all at once. It leaks away little by little, almost unnoticed. A tense message, an unexpected criticism, a piece of news you weren't prepared to receive, and something inside you starts to shift. Your body keeps functioning, but internally, your mind has already entered alert mode. You try to keep your composure, take a deep breath, maybe whisper a quick prayer, but you can feel that inside you're already reacting. The question isn't whether you have faith. The question is whether you have mental governance. Many people believe anxiety is simply an inevitable emotion under pressure, but most of the time, anxiety is the result of ungoverned focus. It's the mind repeating a negative interpretation until it feels like absolute truth. You're not reacting only to what happened. You're reacting to the meaning you assign to it. And when that meaning goes unexamined, it takes authority over your emotions. In Philippians 4:6 it says, "Do not be anxious about anything." That statement is not decorative, it's not poetic, it's a direct instruction. The Bible doesn't ignore difficult circumstances, but it draws a clear boundary. You were not called to be governed by them. There is a difference between acknowledging a problem and allowing it to control your emotional structure. Emotional reactivity is a learned pattern over time. If you grew up interpreting conflict as threat or criticism as rejection, your mind built automatic shortcuts. Every time something similar happens, you follow the same mental path. It becomes so fast that it feels natural. But natural doesn't mean healthy, it simply means repeated. When you live reacting, you live in defensive mode. And people in defensive mode rarely think clearly. Governing is different from reacting. Reacting is automatic, impulsive, immediate. Governing is deliberate, conscious, strategic. Reacting happens in the impulse. Governing happens in the decision. That difference changes the entire emotional outcome. This is where many Christians become frustrated. They pray for peace, but continue allowing their minds to interpret events the same way as always. The prayer is made, but the mental pattern is never confronted. The heart seeks comfort, but the mind keeps producing negative narratives. And as long as the narrative remains intact, instability returns. Emotional instability is not a synonym for lack of spirituality. Often, it's a lack of strategy. You can deeply love God and still not have developed mental discipline. You can memorize verses and still not know how to apply them to your daily interpretation of life. Faith without directed focus produces cycles. Faith with directed focus produces stability. Emotions always follow interpretation. Two people can receive the same news and respond in completely different ways. The event is identical. The reading is different. And that reading determines the intensity of the emotional response. When the mind interprets something as threat, the body responds with tension. When the mind interprets with perspective, emotion finds balance. Maybe you've noticed this pattern in yourself. You pray for calm, but continue rehearsing arguments in your mind. You pray for confidence, but keep anticipating the worst-case scenario. You pray for strength, but continue feeding thoughts of failure. The prayer didn't fail. What remained untouched was the automatic interpretation that was never interrupted. That's why small situations feel disproportionately large. When your mind is already inclined toward insecurity, any silence feels like rejection. When it's inclined toward scarcity, any delay feels like threat. The problem doesn't begin in the event. It begins in the lens through which you see the event. And if the lens is distorted, the emotion will be intensified accordingly. You don't lose your peace because of one isolated event. You lose your peace because you allow a thought to repeat without governance. Repeated thought becomes emotional state. Repeated emotional state becomes behavioral pattern. And over time, that pattern begins to shape your identity, even if it was never who you were meant to be. If the problem is ungoverned interpretation, then the solution cannot be merely emotional. It's not enough to try to feel calmer. You need a tool that intervenes before the emotion solidifies, something that works at the level of focus, not just sensation. A strategy that interrupts the cycle at the beginning, before it dominates your mind. The good news is that the Bible doesn't just diagnose the problem, it offers a practical path. If anxiety is born from ungoverned focus, stability is born from redirected focus. There is a spiritual decision capable of redefining how you read events and altering your emotional response. And that decision begins to reveal the weapon you may not be using yet. Have you ever tried to be grateful and realized you felt nothing? Have you spoken words of thanks while internally remaining restless, irritated, or worried? This is where many people give up, because they've learned to treat gratitude as spontaneous emotion. If there's no positive feeling attached, they assume it's fake. But the mistake begins in that definition. Biblical gratitude doesn't originate in what you feel. It originates in what you decide. In 1 Thessalonians 5:18 it says, "In everything give thanks." Notice the command is not conditioned on a favorable emotional state. It doesn't say when you feel comfortable or when you understand what God is doing. It says in everything. That is not passivity in the face of difficulty. It is positioning in the face of difficulty. God is not asking for enthusiasm. He is instructing a conscious choice that redirects mental direction. When you decide to give thanks in the middle of pressure, something invisible begins to happen. You interrupt the automatic narrative of complaint. Complaining is natural to the human mind. It tends to magnify what's wrong, highlight what's missing, replay what caused pain. Deliberate gratitude enters like a command that breaks that repetitive flow and creates a strategic pause. That pause is powerful because it prevents negative thought from gaining momentum. Thoughts, when uninterrupted, organize into stories. Stories become emotional convictions. Emotional convictions shape behavior. When you choose gratitude before the negative narrative consolidates, you prevent that chain from advancing unchecked. This does not mean denying pain. It does not mean pretending everything is resolved or minimizing the issue. It means refusing to let the problem have the final word over your interpretation. Gratitude acts as a conscious filter. It may not immediately change the external fact, but it changes the meaning you are assigning to it. Complaint reinforces helplessness. Every time you mentally rehearse what is wrong, you strengthen the feeling that there is no way forward. The mind begins to believe it is trapped, limited, without alternatives. Gratitude, on the other hand, reinforces inner authority. When you choose to give thanks, even if nothing has changed yet, you communicate to your own mind that you are not entirely at the mercy of circumstances. This is where the idea of a weapon begins to make sense. A weapon is not used when everything is calm. It is used in conflict. Gratitude is not a decorative gesture of faith reserved for favorable seasons. It is a strategic tool used under pressure. It operates directly in the field where anxiety and reactivity are formed. Your focus. Maybe you've always associated gratitude with celebration, with answered prayers, with visible blessings, but Scripture places gratitude precisely where the natural tendency would be to complain. That changes the entire spiritual logic. Instead of reacting to the scenario, you choose to define your posture before the scenario defines you. When you give thanks deliberately, you reposition the center of your attention. Instead of fixating only on threat, you force your mind to remember what remains stable. Instead of magnifying risk, you magnify perspective. And perspective is what stabilizes emotion under pressure. Emotions may not disappear, but they lose intensity when focus is adjusted. Gratitude does not wait for circumstances to change in order to respond positively. It acts first. It builds internal structure while the external environment is still uncertain. That is the part that requires maturity, because you are choosing to act based on conviction, not sensation. Maybe you've been waiting to feel peace before giving thanks, but the biblical order is the opposite. You give thanks, and that begins to build peace. You decide, and the emotion gradually reorganizes. This reversal breaks emotional dependence on circumstances and begins to develop real inner governance. If anxiety is the result of repeated focus on the problem, gratitude is the deliberate redirection of that focus. It may not remove the challenge immediately, but it redefines the weight that challenge carries inside you. And when the weight shifts, the reaction shifts. When the reaction shifts, the pattern begins to break consistently. This leads to an even deeper question. If gratitude is a strategic decision, how exactly does that decision reorganize the mental structure that produces anxiety? How can a seemingly simple choice begin to alter consolidated emotional patterns? To answer that, we need to look at the real field where this battle takes place and understand where focus is truly established. There is something you may have never examined carefully enough. Your mind is never neutral. It is always fixed on something. Even when you think you're just thinking about your day, you are actually feeding a specific focus. And that steady focus, repeated hour after hour, shapes your emotional state more than any isolated event ever could. In Colossians 3:2 it says, "Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things." This is not an abstract phrase reserved for religious moments. It is a direct instruction about mental positioning. Thinking is an action. Directing thought is a decision. If you don't deliberately choose where your mind will rest, it will automatically be drawn to whatever captures your attention most, usually whatever feels most threatening. The real battlefield is not the external event. It is the internal focus you maintain after the event. The situation may last minutes, the interpretation can last hours, and the longer you mentally revisit a threat, the more emotional weight it gains. Repeated thought becomes a continuous inner climate. This is where gratitude stops being symbolic and becomes structural. When you choose to give thanks, you are not ignoring the problem. You are shifting the center of attention. You are preventing the problem from occupying all available mental space. That shift may seem small, but its impact is deep. Most people assume emotion determines focus. In reality, focus determines emotion. Whatever you repeatedly revisit creates corresponding feelings. If you replay the criticism you received, it grows in intensity. If you rehearse what might go wrong, your body responds with constant tension. Emotion doesn't appear randomly. It follows the direction of your attention. When you choose gratitude deliberately, you train your mind to consider an alternative perspective before the negative narrative consolidates. You teach your brain not to accept the first thought as final. That decision creates space between stimulus and response, and in that space, inner governance begins to form. You may have noticed that certain thoughts keep returning. They return because they were repeated. Repetition creates a path. A path creates a pattern. A pattern creates an automatic response. Gratitude steps directly into that cycle to disrupt the dominant repetition. It introduces a different kind of thought that begins to compete with the old one. Gratitude is a conscious repositioning of the lens. Instead of magnifying only what threatens you, you also magnify what remains steady. Instead of fixing your mind only on what is lacking, you fix it on what is still sustaining you. This does not remove difficulty, but it prevents difficulty from monopolizing your interpretation of reality. The common mistake is trying to change emotion without changing focus. Many ask God to feel peace while continuing to feed thoughts that produce anxiety. They want stability, but keep rehearsing negative scenarios. Emotional transformation begins with disciplined attention. When you practice deliberate gratitude, you begin weakening negative mental loops. Each time you choose to give thanks, you reinforce a new neural and spiritual pathway. You teach your mind not to fixate only on risk, but also on provision. And that conscious repetition builds a new emotional foundation over time. That is why controlling focus means controlling response. It doesn't mean becoming indifferent to challenges. It means refusing to be automatically dragged by them. Gratitude is not decorative language or shallow optimism. It is a mental repositioning tool that redefines where your emotional energy will be invested. If this content is opening your eyes and helping you see your patterns more clearly, subscribe to the channel. Here, we focus on practical transformation, not just momentary encouragement. Our goal is to strengthen your mind so your faith becomes structure, not just emotion. But we need to go deeper. If focus can be consciously repositioned, what happens internally when that practice becomes consistent? How does this new pattern begin generating real protection against anxiety and instability? That's what we need to understand next. There is a profound difference between feeling peace and being guarded by peace. Many people confuse these two realities. Feeling peace is emotional, variable, and dependent on circumstances. Being guarded by peace is structural, built and sustained by principles. A sensation can disappear in minutes, a structure remains under pressure. And that is exactly the distinction Philippians 4:6-7 reveals, when it says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and your minds." The word guard is not accidental. It is military language. It carries the idea of standing watch, protecting, holding strategic position. It does not describe a soft emotion that visits during pleasant moments. It describes an active force that remains on alert. That means biblical peace is not fragile. It functions like an internal sentry. Notice also that the text does not separate prayer from gratitude. It says, with thanksgiving. Gratitude is not a secondary detail. It is part of the mechanism that leads to peace that guards. Many ask God for intervention while ignoring the strategic dimension of gratitude in the process. And that changes the internal outcome completely. Biblical peace is not the absence of external pressure. It is the presence of internal protection. Pressure may continue outside. Circumstances may not change immediately. What changes is how they are processed within you. And that shift does not happen through spontaneous emotion, but through repeated discipline. When you practice gratitude deliberately, you activate a principle that reorganizes your mental system. You present your request to God, but you do not feed anxiety alongside it. You acknowledge the need, but you refuse to let it dominate your focus. That combination, conscious request and deliberate gratitude, builds a structure of stability. Imagine a city without walls. Any threat enters easily. Now imagine a city with constant watch and controlled gates. The threat may exist outside, but it does not enter without resistance. Your mind operates in a similar way. Without disciplined focus, any negative thought crosses the threshold and settles in. Within a governance, thoughts are filtered before becoming dominant emotion. Gratitude functions as an essential part of that defense system. It reduces the intensity of automatic interpretation. It prevents the problem from becoming absolute. It reminds your mind that the current scenario does not define your identity or determine your future. That reminder, repeated over time, builds real emotional shielding. This does not mean you will never feel anxiety. It means anxiety will not have continuous dominion. There is a massive difference between experiencing a momentary emotional impulse and living under its constant control. When peace begins guarding your mind, you notice you react with less impulsiveness, less dramatization, and more clarity. Many seek peace only when they are already overwhelmed, but the biblical principle presented here is preventive. Gratitude is not merely medicine after crisis, it is daily practice that strengthens structure before the next crisis arrives. You build protection before you fully need it. The more you repeat this process, the stronger the internal guard becomes. Situations that once destabilized you completely begin to carry less impact. Negative news is still noticed, but it does not dominate. Criticism is still heard, but it does not define your worth. Unexpected problems still require adjustment, but they do not produce emotional collapse. Stability is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of governance, and governance requires training. Every time you choose gratitude under pressure, you reinforce an invisible structure that sustains your mind. Over time, what once required conscious effort becomes a consolidated posture. But a decisive question remains. How does this posture manifest when the environment is clearly unfavorable? How does gratitude operate when there is real scarcity, when there is no immediate evidence of solution? To understand that concretely, we need to look at an example where emotional leadership preceded external change. Imagine standing in front of a clearly insufficient scenario. Limited resources, people expecting an immediate solution, pressure increasing by the minute. This is the kind of environment that usually generates collective tension, impulsive decisions, and racing thoughts. Scarcity has the power to disorganize the mind before any action is even taken. And it is precisely in this context that we see a decisive principle being applied. In John 6:11, before the multiplication of the loaves, it is recorded that Jesus took the bread and gave thanks. Pay close attention to the order. There was no visible miracle yet. There was no multiplication. There were few resources facing a great need. There was external expectation and concrete limitation. And still, the first posture was gratitude. This reveals something profound about emotional leadership under pressure. Gratitude in that moment was not celebration of a result already achieved. It was a declaration of trust before the result. Jesus did not react to scarcity as if it had final authority over the outcome. He established an inner posture before any external change occurred. That detail completely reshapes how you understand stability. Most people wait for the situation to improve before adjusting their emotional state, but the biblical pattern shows the opposite. Inner posture is defined first. Gratitude was not the consequence of the miracle. It was part of the atmosphere that preceded the miracle. When you give thanks in the middle of scarcity, you are communicating something to your own mind. You are saying that the current scenario is not sovereign over your identity. You acknowledge the limitation, but you refuse to let it determine your final interpretation. That decision reduces panic and increases clarity. Panic is born when the mind concludes there is no possible alternative. It emerges when focus is fixed exclusively on lack. Gratitude breaks that fixation. Even without visible solution, it affirms that there is more happening than what you can see. That is not naivety. It is deliberate perspective. Notice also the collective impact of this posture. Jesus stood before a crowd. Emotions are contagious. If he had reacted with anxiety, anxiety would have spread quickly. But by giving thanks, he established stability. His inner posture shaped the external environment. This applies directly to your life. You may not be standing before 5,000 people, but you are standing before responsibilities, decisions, and real pressures. Your internal reaction shapes your capacity to respond. If you enter a scarcity mindset, creativity decreases. If you maintain deliberate gratitude, your mind remains functional. Gratitude does not deny reality. It creates balance within reality. It prevents lack from occupying 100% of your mental field. When the problem stops monopolizing your attention, you regain the ability to think clearly and act strategically. Maybe you have been waiting for something external to change before recovering your peace. But John 6 shows that internal change can, and often must, precede external change. Gratitude does not depend on multiplication happening. It prepares your internal ground to walk through the process without emotional collapse. This practice develops active trust, not passive trust that ignores need, but trust that keeps mind and emotion aligned while the solution is still forming. And when this posture is repeated, it begins to become part of your emotional identity. Gratitude under scarcity is emotional leadership in action. It is choosing not to dramatize prematurely. It is maintaining inner governance when the environment tries to pull you into instability. And that repeated choice builds practical maturity. But there is a scenario even more challenging than scarcity. Scarcity still allows visible hope. Now imagine injustice, physical pain, forced limitation, and no immediate evidence of solution. It is precisely there that gratitude reveals itself as a weapon in an even more intense way. Now imagine a scenario even more severe than scarcity. It is not just lack of resources, it is injustice, it is physical pain, it is forced restriction. It is being in a place you did not choose, paying a price that does not seem deserved. It is in this context that gratitude operates in an even more radical way. In Acts 16:25, it says that Paul and Silas, unjustly imprisoned, were praying and singing hymns to God. Look at the environment. They were not in comfort. They were chained. They were not being recognized. They were being punished. There was no immediate evidence of change. Yet the posture chosen was praise. This was not spontaneous emotion. It was not natural enthusiasm. It was strategic decision. When someone chooses gratitude under real pain, they are declaring something powerful. My identity will not be defined by my current circumstance. That changes the entire internal dynamic of pressure. Injustice has the potential to produce bitterness. Pain has the potential to produce resentment. Forced limitation has the potential to produce despair. These are automatic mental pathways. But Paul and Silas chose another path. They interrupted the emotional cycle before it consolidated. Gratitude in that context was not denial of pain. They knew they were imprisoned, they knew they were suffering, but they decided that pain would not govern the final interpretation of their situation. That is inner governance in its clearest form. When you choose gratitude under unjust pressure, you protect your emotional identity. You prevent circumstances from redefining who you are. External pain may exist, but internal collapse does not have to follow. That distinction is critical. Many people believe they can only give thanks when there is visible evidence that something is improving. But Scripture shows that gratitude can precede any visible sign. It does not depend on external change. It depends on internal decision. And something interesting happens in Acts 16. While they maintained that posture, the environment was affected. The text says there was an earthquake and the doors were opened. But notice something important. External release came after internal stability. The posture preceded the movement. This teaches an essential principle. When your mind remains governed under pressure, you move through the situation with clarity. Even if the solution does not come immediately, you do not lose your structure. You remain lucid, you remain conscious, you remain steady. Gratitude under injustice is a weapon against emotional corrosion. It prevents pain from becoming identity. It prevents pressure from becoming bitterness. It prevents waiting from becoming despair. It keeps your interior intact while the exterior is still in process. Maybe you are living through something that feels unjust. Maybe you are walking through a season where nothing seems to change. The question is not whether you feel like giving thanks. The question is whether you are willing to protect your mind while you move through the process. Because when the mind remains governed, the circumstance loses dominion. And when the circumstance loses dominion, you pass through pressure without losing who you are. That is not emotional weakness. It is maturity forged under fire. But this cannot remain an isolated event. It cannot be merely a reaction to crisis. It must become continuous discipline, and it is exactly that discipline that transforms gratitude into a permanent structure of inner authority. Now we reach the point where this stops being an isolated event and becomes discipline. Giving thanks in a specific moment is powerful, but building inner authority requires repetition. It requires consistency. It requires deliberate practice. This is where gratitude stops being a strategic reaction and becomes a structuring routine. In Proverbs 4:23 it says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Guarding implies continuous vigilance. It is not occasional action, it is daily responsibility. If the heart, which includes mind, emotions, and intentions, is the source of life, then it requires constant protection. At this level, gratitude becomes a daily tool of emotional maintenance, not only when there is crisis, not only when pressure is intense, but as a regular practice of inner governance. Small, repeated decisions build accumulated stability. You do not develop emotional maturity by accident. It is the result of consistent choices. Every time you choose gratitude before complaint, you strengthen a pattern. Every time you interrupt a negative thought with perspective, you reinforce discipline. Over time, what once felt forced becomes natural posture. Discipline outlasts emotion. Emotion is variable. Discipline is structural. When you depend only on what you feel, your stability fluctuates. When you depend on what you decide, your structure strengthens. Disciplined gratitude builds a foundation that does not rely on mood or circumstance. Inner governance is cumulative. It does not appear fully formed. It develops through conscious repetition. At first, giving thanks when nothing has changed may feel unnatural, but each repetition trains your mind to respond differently. It creates a new mental and spiritual pathway. Over time, you begin to notice that certain situations no longer trigger the same intensity of reaction. Not because they disappeared, but because your structure changed. That is real growth, not the absence of challenges, but the presence of maturity. Gratitude as discipline also strengthens character. It cultivates patience, perspective, and self-control. It reduces impulsiveness and increases clarity. It prevents small pressures from producing exaggerated reactions, and that transforms the way you move through daily life. Maybe you are looking for a quick solution to emotional instability, but the biblical path goes deeper than that. It points to daily practice. Small acts of inner governance repeated over time create a solid foundation that does not easily collapse. If this content is helping you see your faith in a more practical and structured way, subscribe to the channel. Here we develop spiritual maturity applied to everyday life, so your faith becomes real stability, not just momentary inspiration. In the end, gratitude is not denying pain. It is not pretending everything is fine. It is not shallow spirituality. It is deliberate choice. It is discipline that builds internal authority. It is structure that no one can take from you. Tonight, before you go to sleep, consciously choose 3 difficult situations that have not changed yet. Do not give thanks because you feel like it. Give thanks as an act of governance, as a decision, as a practice of maturity. That is the beginning of a new emotional structure. Throughout this video, you've seen that gratitude is not a pleasant emotion reserved for calm days. It is a strategic decision that reorganizes your mind. It is not spontaneous feeling. It is a deliberate tool. And when used consistently, it builds something far greater than a passing sensation. It builds stability. You do not lose your peace simply because of what happens. You lose your peace because of the interpretation you allow to remain. And that is exactly where gratitude acts. It redefines focus. It interrupts mental cycles. It prevents circumstances from having absolute authority over your identity. Gratitude does not deny pain. It does not ignore injustice. It does not pretend scarcity does not exist. It simply refuses to allow those realities to become the final center of your attention. It creates internal space for perspective, and perspective reduces reactivity. You saw in Scripture that gratitude appears before the multiplication, inside the prison, and in the middle of instruction against anxiety. That is not coincidence. It is pattern. The Bible positions gratitude as an active practice of emotional governance, not spiritual decoration. Maybe you've been waiting for something external to change so you can finally feel stable. But the invitation today is the opposite. Stability begins within. It begins with a conscious choice repeated every day. It begins when you decide that your mind will not be automatically dragged by every circumstance. Gratitude is the weapon you already have. You do not need another revelation. You do not need perfect conditions. You only need to decide to use it. And the more you use it, the stronger your emotional structure will become. Before you sleep tonight, choose 3 situations that have not changed yet. Maybe something that still hurts. Maybe something that feels delayed. Maybe something that seems unfair. And declare gratitude for each one, not as emotion, but as an act of inner governance. This small exercise may seem simple, but this is how discipline is built. And this is how stability is formed. One decision at a time, one redirected focus at a time. If this video helped you see your faith in a more strategic and practical way, share it with someone who needs to strengthen their mind and stabilize their emotions. Here we build maturity, not just motivation. Now the question is not whether you feel like giving thanks. The question is, are you willing to use the weapon you have already been given? And that decision begins today.